Chapter 4. The Anatomy of Domestic Discrimination. Domestic discrimination is rarely dramatic in the moment. It's usually a grammar, a set of small, repeated linguistic and relational rules that shape daily life until the rules become truth. Over years, those rules produce predictable outcomes, an internalized shame, an anxious nervous system, and the slow grinding down of capacities we once took for granted. This chapter maps that grammar. It names the mechanisms I lived through, and watched other people live through. Silence as punishment, conditional love, the double bind, gaslighting, favoritism and marginalization, financial and social control. Intergenerational repetition. Each is ordinary. Each is powerful. Each is part of a system that, left unexamined, creates the very atrophy I described in the last chapter. Example 1. Silence as a weapon. Silence is not always the absence of speech. At its cruelest, silence is a deliberate technique, a slow, surgical withdrawal that communicates contempt without spectacle. I remember a dozen little silences, calls not returned, visits that fizzled, the polite posture that signaled I had failed the unspoken test. No dramatic words. No televised fights. Just a steady unavailableness that taught me, again and again, that my needs were negotiable. Silence works because it's ambiguous. It forces the person on the receiving end to guess and to self-blame. What did I do? Am I too sensitive? Should I apologize for what I didn't know I'd done? In families that weaponize silence, apologies and performances become the currency of belonging. The price is emotional labor. The person trying to belong must constantly orient to another's moods, attempting to repair a harm that may never be named. Psychologically, silence undermines trust and saps initiative. Neurologically, it trains hypervigilance. Over years, silence teaches the nervous system that reaching out is risky. It teaches the mind to conserve effort, the first step towards psychological atrophy. 2. Conditional love, the contract of acceptance. Many families express affection but only under terms. This conditional love is perhaps the most insidious mechanism because it disguises power as care. You can have our approval if you, is the contract many of us internalize without much fanfare. The conditions vary: silence about certain topics, certain career choices, certain loyalties. Success and achievement may be welcomed as spectacle provided they remain within safe parameters. Too much independence, too much dissent, or too much emotional honesty becomes threatening. I learned to measure my worth by the terms of acceptance. If the family's approval was suspended the moment I pursued my projects or asked for accountability, I began to see affection as a commodity. Conditional love is controlling because it substitutes approval for unconditional belonging. It trains people to perform conformity and conceal vulnerability. When love is conditional, the person who wants to be loved becomes a performer on an invisible stage, always watching for cues, always calculating the cost. 3. The double bind. Damned if you do and damned if you don't. A double bind is a structural trap. No response is safe. Speak up and you may be punished. Keep quiet and your needs remain unaddressed. Either way, you lose. This is the pattern I lived under for years. When I tried to assert myself, I was branded as unstable or difficult. When I did nothing, I was described as unpresent or ungrateful. The message was constant: there is no route back to safety unless you mirror the family's desire for silence. Double binds are psychologically devastating because they produce learned helplessness. The person learns that any attempt to influence the environment is fruitless or dangerous. The result is withdrawal and self-reassure, another pathway to atrophy. 4. Gaslighting, redefining reality. Gaslighting is a term that's been used widely, sometimes loosely, but its dynamics are specific and corrosive. It involves consistent denial of another person's experience. That never happened, you're overreacting, you remember it wrong. I was told, in different ways and at different times, that my perceptions were unreliable. Events I remembered vividly were reframed as misunderstandings or as symptomatic of my mental health. Over time, those reframings stuck. Doubt crept in. Gaslighting doesn't have to be grand. It's the small, repeated renegotiation of memory and meaning. Its power is that it dislocates your sense of reality. Once that anchor goes, other capacities, confidence, assertiveness, agency atrophy. 5. Favoritism and marginalization in the family hierarchy. Most families have hierarchies. Favoritism in the elevation of certain members and the ongoing marginalization of others becomes a lifelong syllabus about worth. Being the marginal person in a family teaches you that some lives are worth more emotional investment than others. It shapes identity through contrast. You define yourself by what you're not allowed to be. Socially, favoritism teaches children to view relationships as transactional. It normalizes the unequal distribution of care and skews moral imagination. On a societal scale, this is the seedbed for inequality. People learn early that some people are less worthy of compassion and resources. 6. Financial, social, and practical control. Control takes many forms. It can be emotional withholding, but it can also be economic or practical, limiting access to funds, opportunities, or social networks. Families may use money, housing, or social capital to incentivize compliance. Economic control is particularly pernicious because it hits survival systems. The person controlled may feel trapped, dependent on the same system that punishes them. Financial control amplifies psychological atrophy by restricting the means to change one's environment. 7. Shame, blame, and the policing of vulnerability. Shame is a cultural lubricant that keeps the machine running. Shame's job is to make vulnerability expensive. If being open risks ridicule, exile, or being labeled difficult, many will opt for concealment. Shame migrates from the family to the self. You internalize the critical voice and learn to self-police. Vulnerability becomes dangerous. The muscles of trust atrophy because they are not exercised. A culture of shame also isolates survivors. Confession brings the risk of ostracism, and silence brings slow decline. That's the terrible bind. 8. Intergenerational repetition, inherited patterns. Most of the mechanisms above are not unique episodes, they're generational programs. Families inherit relational strategies along with last names. A parent who was taught to retaliate with silence often repeats the same with their children, sometimes unconsciously. Breaking these patterns is harder because they are encoded in narrative and ritual. Who gets honored, how conflict is managed, what topics are taboo. To address domestic discrimination, you must address generational memory. 9. Institutional collusion, when society backs the home. One of the reasons domestic discriminations persists is that institutions often treat the home as a private domain, beyond intervention. Schools, workplaces, and even healthcare systems may normalize family-based exclusion as private problems. This institutional deference creates an ecosystem of invisibility. When agencies default to non-intervention, the family's private harms remain private, leaving the person exposed and unsupported. 10. The feedback loop, atrophy and reinforcement. Perhaps the cruelest feature is how these mechanisms reinforce each other. Silence begets shame, shame begets withdrawal, withdrawal begets marginalization, marginalization begets further silence. The loop tightens and the person's emotional muscles find fewer opportunities to exercise. At the same time, the family's own narrative is reinforced. They interpret withdrawal as confirmation of pathology. With each misread, the system doubles down. And so the cycle accelerates. Illustration: a day in the life. Imagine a routine. A text asking about your book goes unanswered for days. When you bring it up, you're told you're pushy. A birthday comes with polite nods but no private call. You're invited to the family dinner, but when you arrive, the conversations steer away from topics you care about. Your achievements are minimized. You leave feeling exhausted and unseen. Now imagine that pattern repeated for months and years. It's not drama that wears you down, it's routine neglect. That accumulation is what reshapes the brain and the heart. What sustains these patterns? Why don't people simply change? Several forces maintain the system. Fear of disruption. Change threatens identity and narrative. Cognitive dissonance. It's easier to rationalize harm than to overhaul long-held stories. Social cost. Speaking out can mean exile, which makes silence safer. Lack of language. Without concepts like psychological atrophy or domestic discrimination, people can't name what's happening. Breaking the system requires all of those things: courage, new language, and new forms of support. A roadmap out. Understanding the anatomy is not an exercise in blame, it's the first step toward repair. If you can name the mechanisms, you can target them. Interrupt silence, create predictable, safe channels of communication. Dismantle conditional love, build relationships where care doesn't depend on performance. Expose the double bind, make rules explicit, refuse impossible choices. Call out gaslighting, maintain a private record of events to preserve reality. Redress favoritism, affirm those who are marginalized, redistribute care. Remove economic levers, create autonomy where control is financial. Heal generational patterns, use therapy and ritual to rewrite narratives. Institutional support, advocate for systems that treat emotional neglect as a public health issue. Closing thought. Anatomy is a map, not a verdict. The anatomy of domestic discrimination shows where the body is weak and therefore where healing work must focus. Naming the mechanisms does not condemn families to permanent fracture, it gives them the vocabulary to change. In the next chapter, we will examine the science behind these mechanisms, how the brain adapts, what neuroplasticity can do for recovery, and what public health research tells us about scaling solutions. Knowing the machinery is only useful if we learn to run it in reverse. Yes, there is credible research emerging around psilocybin and neuroplasticity/healing neuroscience, though much is still early, preliminary, or in controlled settings. We can develop a chapter or section linking psilocybin to your framework of psychological atrophy and recovery. Below is a draft for that chapter/section. Chapter 5. The Science of Disuse. When a person stops moving, the body begins to change. Muscles thin.